All right, so my fellow preaching buddy, my fellow comedy writing pal from our time together in the suburbs of D.C. and a church staff together, and since then, his name's Tim Jones. He comes about once a year to preach here as a guest speaker. He's my buddy, funny dude, also a brilliant, very wise teacher. But we've talked about the topic of apologetics, a defense of the faith. We've talked about logically reasoning through the faith. We've talked about the historicity of the Bible and philosophy and archaeology and all these things. We've talked about that a bunch, but I'll never forget one time him talking to me about, every once in a while I head to an atheist website. And he says, and honestly, I get a little nervous every time I do it, but I feel like, to be honest, working through reasoning the faith, I have to do this every once in a while. So he said I would go to an atheist website and we would have this in common. We'd tell stories about this. And he would say, man, I go to this atheist website and I'd be kind of scared. I'd be kind of nervous. Like, what if there's something that is kind of like, wow, kind of a game changer for me that I've never studied or thought through before, and it's something that kind of puts the nail in the coffin of faith. What if that's there on this website? And here I go. He's like, man, that would be crazy, because I'd have to, if I find some slam dunk argument, I have to change everything I believe. To be honest, I have to change everything I believe. I have to get a whole new set of friends. And so he says, I'd go and I start perusing, going through the arguments. He goes, and then I would come to the end of all the arguments they've listed on this atheist website, and I'd be like, same old poppycock. Like same old boulder dash, same old hogwash, jive, and baloney. He'd be like, it's the same. I've already worked through these arguments, these so-called Bible contradictions, and the so-called problems with reconciling faith and science, or, Christians who say they're Christians in the name of Jesus have done some terrible things throughout history. I've reasoned through and worked through all that stuff, but these are the same old arguments. Like, I've already worked through those. So I mentioned that today because there is one argument that I think that atheists have that I think has some weight to it. I think it's, the most powerful of what you'd call the atheological or atheological arguments against God. And I think that's the strongest and most powerful atheological argument is the argument from evil and suffering. And I think that's, an atheological is an argument against the existence of the traditional classical view of God, a theistic view, or in our case, the God of the Bible. And so you might say, okay, Dan, you're a minister. We know where this is going. We know you're going to land on this or whatever, so you can't think this argument's really a big deal. And I'd say that's quite wrong, honestly. I think this argument, this question, this problem, it carries great weight. I mean, there's a lot behind it. It has a lot of weight. It has a lot of substance. Evil and suffering are real problems. And no one walks away like, I've just knitted that up and put that in a nice little box. It's all good. No one walks away from this issue with that. In fact, after the terrorist attack, September 11, 2001, which many of us lived through, and our kids are now being taught as history in school, which is really weird to me, that's history now. Like, no, that was just then, old guy. But back then, September 11th, 2001, right after it happened, Ellen Johnson, the president of the American Atheist Society, which is the world's largest organization for non-believers, said to the LA Times in October of 2001, she said, if that, September 11th, wasn't a wake-up call to the religious nation of America, I don't know what is. That said to me, there is no God. Where was he? On a coffee break? And so I understand. I think evil and suffering are a very powerful argument against a good and powerful God. I mean, when you think through it, the world is so full of injustice and oppression and death and divorce and addiction and racism and chronic illness and natural catastrophes and terrorism. It goes on and on and on. The list is long of things that we might call evil and suffering. Suffering is universal and it is indiscriminate. It is universal, meaning no matter what era you live in or what neighborhood you live in, you are going to suffer. It's going to happen to you. And it's indiscriminate, meaning it doesn't stack up equally on all people. Okay? Suffering comes sooner and more tragically and in more devastating ways to some than it does to others. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason to. Why? Why him? Why her? Why? Sometimes the good die first, and sometimes the cruelest people live the longest. In fact, that's what we kind of mentioned in week 1 of Footholds, the series. Looking at Psalm 73, we looked at a guy named Asaph, who, like, his whole problem was, the thing that made him doubt was seeing the injustice around him and saying, why are the wicked prospering? I'm sick of seeing this. And that's what caused him to doubt. So suffering creates a major intellectual, emotional, and spiritual problem for every human being. And so we're kind of looking at that really in kind of a headway today, philosophically. We will have, and in the future will again, look at it on more emotional, spiritual levels. But because we're in a apologetic series, I want to kind of look at this mostly from a philosophical standpoint. So let me get in my nerd notebook. This is my notebook that I write down things that are like, man, I don't want to forget that. That puts me in awe of God, or reminds me of God. Or when I doubt or struggle, I need to read some of these things. But the late John Mackey, he was an Australian philosopher, a famous atheist. He would actually debate other theists and Christians because he liked that kind of thing. And he wrote a book called The Miracle Theism, which sounds like a positive thing, but he's really saying it's really a miracle that anybody believes in God. And so the miracle theism, the late John Mackey wrote this. It's kind of the premises for his logical argument. He says, if God exists, he wouldn't create a world filled with pointless evil. 2, the world is filled with pointless evil. 3, therefore the God of the Bible cannot exist. Okay, so that's the way you do premises for logic and a logical argument. And so basically, that's a powerful argument. That really, really is. So how do we handle this issue? How do we handle this problem? Well, here's one really important point to consider, and that's this. To believe in God in the presence of suffering and evil, it gives me great problems, but to disbelieve in God is an even bigger problem. We talked in week 1 about compare footholds. It's a principle for this whole series. It means when you're climbing a mountain of faith and you start to feel like your foothold at that particular point is shaky, then one of the things you have to do is look at where other people are standing. Look at other rocks, faiths that they're putting their foot on and trusting. And Asaph in Psalm 73 looks around and says, man, that's way slipperier, more shaky by far. I would never want to step there. That leads to destruction. And so, which type of faith is more or less slippery, shaky, or dangerous? And the truth is, whether you're an agnostic or an atheist or a follower of Jesus, we are all in the same boat when it comes to evil and suffering. Period. Like, you don't get out from under the problem by saying there is no God, okay? The problem of evil and suffering is still there, right? You can say, I don't believe in God, but you still have to struggle through. So what are your answers to evil and suffering in the world? Like, these problems are with you whether you believe or not. And so in week 2 of the series, we talked about secularism, which is really just saying it's the idea that the universe and matter are all that exists. This cosmos is all that exists. There's no world alongside of it. There's no world after it. There's no world after it. And so, secularism just really says there's no remedy for suffering and evil and death. It's not very helpful when it comes to suffering and evil. Now, in other sermons, I'll get into, and have gotten into just the truth is, if you're a secular person, then your only answer, to suffering and evil in the world is increased satisfaction. And that honestly doesn't work because the horizon of satisfaction is constantly moving forward. You get more, you want more. You get more, you want more. And so, but really, secularism just has no remedy for suffering and evil and death. And no one has articulated this problem better than Annie Dillard, a writer who, in 1974, she wrote this book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Oh, that's in Walton Hills. No, it's not really. This is in Virginia. That would be Tinker's Creek. It's really hard for me not to say Tinker's Creek. But Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. She wrote this in 74. It won a Pulitzer Prize in 1975. This is a really well-written book. I just finished it last month. Man, I don't know that I've read many books from people as smart as her. Her knowledge was unbelievable to me of different sciences and things in the world. But she wrote this book when she moved out to the woods of Virginia's Roanoke Valley by a creek because she wanted to get closer to nature. It just sounds so, I love it. Like, oh, I want to be closer to nature. So she was a secular baby boomer, and she saw injustice in society, and she thought, man, we need to learn more from the harmony of nature. Doesn't that just sound right and good? So she moves near a creek and she begins to observe nature. And that's really what the reflections in this book are about. Her observing nature and reading about it back in her cabin near the creek. So she thought it would make her feel warm and fuzzy and toasty about life, but it didn't. And she was astounded by the violence of nature. And she was sickened by the violence of nature and the relentless bloodiness of nature. She watched female praying mantises devour their baby daddy after they mated. She was like, oh my gosh, that was awful. And she just became sickened by it. She read back in her place about insects and animals who eat their young, and babies and children who eat their parents. And she was reading all about this like this. And one time she's at Tinker Creek and she's sitting there, and 4 feet away at one point she watched a giant water bug. That's actually the name. It's not just, it's called a giant water bug. She watched this giant water bug sting and kill a little frog. And while the frog was paralyzed from the sting, the giant water bug stuck its stinger way down inside of its body and sucked out all of its insides, its brains, its guts, everything, until it collapsed like a deflated football held by Tom Brady, and it became this frog skin bag and sunk in the water. And she didn't see the bug on the other side of the frog at first. It just kept deflating and just sinking down to this empty balloon frog kind of thing. And she's like, what is that? It's 4 feet away from her. And then she saw this thing. And Annie Dillard, it took her so long to get over that sight. And it would you too. You'd be like, Kermit! Oh my gosh! And so this is what Annie Dillard writes in chapter 10. Chapter 10 was worth reading the whole book. It was fascinating. But this is one conclusion she comes to in chapter 10. She says, evolution loves death more than it loves you or me. I had thought to live by the side of the creek in order to shape my life to its free flow, but I seem to have reached a point where I must draw the line. It looks as though the creek is not buoying me up, but dragging me down. Look, the robin may die the most gruesome of slow deaths, and nature is no less pleased. The sun comes up, the creek rolls on, the survivors still sting. I cannot feel that way about your death, nor you about mine, nor either of us about the robins. We value the individual supremely, and nature values him not a whit. It looks for a moment as though I might have to reject this creek life unless I want to be utterly brutalized. Is human culture, with its values, my only real home after all? She's saying, does this mean I have to go back in society where I thought people were so bad? She says, this direction of thought brings me abruptly to a fork in the road where I stand paralyzed, unwilling to go on, for both ways lead to madness. Either this world, my mother, is a monster, or I myself, the other option, am a freak. She says, consider the first option, that the world is a monster. There's not a person in the world who behaves as badly as praying mantises. But wait, you say, there's no right or wrong in nature, secular. Right or wrong is a human concept. Precisely. We are moral creatures then in an amoral world. The universe that suckled us is a monster that does not care if we live or die, does not care if it itself grinds to a halt. It is fixed and blind, a robot programmed to kill. We are free and seeing. We can only try to outwit it at every turn to save our skins. This view requires that a monstrous world running on chance and death, careening blindly from nowhere to nowhere, someone produced wonderful us. I came from the world. I crawled out of a sea of amino acids, and now I must whirl around and shake my fist at the sea and cry shame. You can see why I want a Pulitzer Prize, right? She says, we little blobs of soft tissue crawling around in this planet's skin are right, and the whole universe is wrong. That's that option. She says, or consider the alternate view. The world is fine, but I'm a freak, and having these values is freakish that don't fit in with the world. She said, it is only human feeling that is freakishly amiss. That's the other alternative. The frog that the giant water bug sucked had presumably a rush of pure feeling for about a second before its brains turned to broth. I, however, have been sapped by various strong feelings about that incident almost daily for several years. All right then, if there's nothing wrong with nature, then it's our emotions that are amiss. If I'm a freak, we're freaks, the world is fine, let us go have lobotomies to restore us to a natural state. Then we can leave society again, get back to the creek lobotomized, and live on its banks as untroubled as any muskrat or reed. You first, she says. Go be lobotomized. So this is what she's saying, evolution, if you have a secular worldview, cosmos, the universe, matter, it's all there is, evolution loves death more than it loves you or me. Like nature is red in tooth and claw. Nature runs on violence, natural selection, survival of the fittest. Nature runs. If you have a secular worldview, it's the strong eating the weak. What do you have to complain about? It's the strong eating the weak. Nature doesn't care when the giant water bug savagely wrecks a frog, when a praying mantis eats its mate, when the robin dies, when I die, when you die. Nature doesn't care. The creek rolls on. And so she's saying if there is no God, if there's only nature, if there's only the cosmos, if there's only matter, then where do human values come from? I don't feel the way that nature does. Nature doesn't care about death and suffering and brutalization of their own young and all that kind of stuff. Why does death, evil, and suffering bother us so much? She says, you might say, well, the animals and the bugs, they can do that. But Annie Dillard says, why? Our values don't fit in with that. Why? Why does it not fit? Are we freaks or is the world a monster? And Annie Dillard's saying if nature is all that there is, we really don't have a right to be outraged. You have no right to be outraged at evil and suffering. If matter is all that there is, that we don't have a right. And so she's saying, I'm confused at why I'm outraged. Where do I get my feelings of justice? Where do I get my values? Where do I get my innate compassion? Because they don't fit in with a secular view. She said, I'm going to be utterly brutalized by this creek. I got to move away. Nature matters all that there is. And she's right. Again, the themes of Scripture that are in this series are Romans 1, and this is Romans chapter 2. If you want to see why do our human values not fit in with the animals and the insects, why? Read Romans chapter 2. That evil and suffering, I admit, it is difficult as a believer. It is difficult as a follower of Jesus. But at least I have a right to be outraged. So Voltaire, he says something very similar. I almost wonder if Annie Dillard stole this from Voltaire a little bit as she reflected. Voltaire was a French philosopher and an outspoken critic of Christianity. And he once wrote a poem that was considered one of the most savage literary attacks against people who would try to defend God or say, here's why God might allow evil and suffering in the world and all that kind of stuff. And so Voltaire, let me find it real quick. He wrote this. It's from something called A Poem on the Lisbon Disaster. And he wrote this. I'm just going to read two stanzas. He says, I'm a puny part of a great whole, yes. But all animals condemned to live, all sentient beings born by the same stern law, suffer like me, and like me also die. So everything suffers and dies. And then the other stanza that I'll read says, man is a stranger to his own research. He knows not whence he comes, nor whither he goes. And I love this line, tormented atoms in a bed of mud. That's what you are without God. If we don't have God, what are we? We're tormented atoms in a bed of mud, devoured by death, a mockery of fate. So this is what we get to, no God. If you take the secular worldview, all it is the universe, matter. That's all there is the cosmos. Then what you get to be is tormented atoms in a bed of mud, devoured by death, Voltaire says. Poetic, yet tragic. He's saying, we're humans, we're such a puny part of this universe. All living things suffer and die. We just heard that from Annie Dillard. But I'm the only one who's bothered by it. I'm the only one that cares. I'm the only one tormented by it. Humans are tormented atoms in a bed of mud. Again, compare Footholds. Evil and suffering, it's a struggle if you believe in God. Why would God allow it? But then there's this foothold over here. matter, the cosmos, the universe is all that there is. Well, cool. Over there, we get to be tormented atoms in a bed of mud that leads to death. So if you don't believe in God, that's all that there is. So this is the problem with the secular, atheistic, agnostic approach. And honestly, it's not helpful at all. There's no hope in it, absolutely whatsoever. So let's go back to John Mackey's premises, and you'll see that there's actually an assumption in the middle. There's actually an assumption in the center. The world is filled with pointless evil. Well, there's an assumption there in the middle of that, and that is this. The assumption is that evil and suffering are all pointless. That there couldn't have ever been a point that what he's saying is, I can't see any point in evil and suffering. I can't see any point to this. Therefore, God couldn't have a reason to allow it to continue to happen. He's saying, because I can't see it. So think about it this way. If a novice chess player can't figure out why a chess master makes a certain move, the novice can say or think that it was a pointless move, but really, they can't know, and they're probably wrong if it's a novice chess player versus a master chess master. And when you think about that, you look at the Old Testament story in the Hebrew Scriptures of a dude named Joseph. And Joseph was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, and then he ends up a slave in Egypt, and he's serving a high-ranking master faithfully. And then that master has an evil wife who falsely makes some accusations against him, and he ends up being thrown in jail. And get this, God permitted all of it. God permits it. God allows evil people to use their free will against Joseph. And then, through God's mercy, Joseph eventually is given a position of great power and favor in Egypt. And through his position, he eventually is able to save many lives during a severe famine. And during that famine, his brothers, thinking Joseph's probably dead, show up before Joseph. They don't even recognize him. And Joseph later tells his guilty brothers who are brought before him, he says this. He says to them, "Don't be afraid. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Repeat that with me 2 times, if you will. 2 times, this part in the yellow. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. That's a great little memory verse for someone who has had someone do something awful to them. Some kind of abuse, some kind of betrayal. Like, to understand, this is what you meant. What you did was you used your free will to do something evil to me. But God has this unique way of repurposing the evil that is done to us. He has this unique way of taking the suffering that's not his will, that we suffer or have evil things done to us. Say, I'm going to repurpose that. Like this wood that here we go back here. I'm going to repurpose that. I'm going to absolutely repurpose that. So in all of his experience, Joseph saw the hand of God working for his good. And throughout the story, it's remarkable that Joseph never plays the victim. He doesn't assume his suffering is pointless. He knows, I'm a novice chess player, and I love God, so I know God's working behind the scenes, and he's taking these evil things happening to me. He's going to repurpose them, use them for a purpose. And the whole time he's thinking God's not surprised by this. He'll figure out a way to repurpose this. And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, he states this categorically, what's happened to Joseph. He says it categorically. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And that when evil and suffering occur, that God weeps with us. That God's not like, hey, that was my will that your grandfather, died. That was my will that you got cancer. That was my will. No, he weeps with us, but he says, I'm going to use this. I love that in that verse, it's like God goes to work. He goes to work on our behalf to use the evil as a tool, to grow us, to deepen us, to move us forward spiritually, to serve and minister to others, to create a brand new, unexpected path to blessing. God's like, I'm going to work this. I'm going to rework it. I'm going to repurpose this. This is not what I wanted the world to be like. But that suffering, that evil, I'm going to repurpose it. So why does God not stop evil? Man, that is a tough question. But could it be that there's an all-good, all-knowing God who is great enough to have reasons for allowing evil to continue that you and I might not even be able to discern on the chessboard? Like that we can't be absolutely sure that suffering is pointless, That we definitely can't prove that it's pointless, and therefore it doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. There could be meaning and repurposing behind the evil and pain. In fact, a Christian philosopher named Alvin Plantinga wrote this, and this is something I had to put in my nerd notebook too. He says this. He says, "It is indeed true that suffering and evil can occasion spiritual perplexity and discouragement. And of all the anti-theistic arguments, only the argument from evil deserves to be taken seriously. But I also believe that there's at least as strong an argument for the reality of God from the existence of horrendous evil. The most appalling kinds of evil are human cruelty and wickedness. Stalin and Pol Pot, Hitler and his henchmen. But could there really be any such thing as horrifying wickedness if there were no God and we just evolved? I don't see how. An atheist way of looking at the world has no place for genuine moral obligation of any sort. All moral categories are either evolved or socially constructed. All strong eating the weak in nature, or is natural to the evolutionary process. And thus there's no way without God to say anything is genuinely appalling, unjust, or wicked. Therefore, there can be such a thing only if there was a way that rational creatures are supposed to live, obligated to live. Atheism can speak only of foolishness, acting contrary to what you take to be your own interests, but it cannot accommodate appalling wickedness. Accordingly, if you think there's such a thing as horrifying wickedness and not just an illusion of some sort, you have a powerful argument for the reality of God. So just to say, he's saying, just to say that evil is appalling, that exists in the world, this is awful, you have to have some standard that we should live by, and you can't have that standard, moral absolutes, without a God. So he says the existence of evil, things that we can look at and be appalled at, they're themselves actually a proof that God exists, or we would have no standard to compare those two. So it's a big problem to look around at evil and suffering in the world and believe in God, but it's an even bigger problem to look around at the evil and suffering and believe that there is no God. Again, it's comparing footholds. So you may say, hypothetically, if you have a secular worldview, like, man, I think beating up women, I think white cops killing black men, I think gunmen killing innocent people is terrible. I would say, I agree, but it's because I believe that all humans are created in God's image. Why are you appalled by it? Why are you frustrated? Why do you look at it and say, this is a terrible, terrible thing? Why is it terrible? On what standard? I agree. But why do you think this stuff is terrible? If there's not, if we're here through the strong eating the weak, this is what you learn at Tinker Creek. How else would you explain that this is appalling and evil? So you might say, okay, yeah, but this isn't philosophical for me. This is personal. And like I said, that I'll cover and I have covered, but I do want to spend just a second on that as you say, man, this topic isn't just philosophical, this is philosophical, this is personal to me, but you have to remember that there are plenty of people who've had terrible, terrible things happen to them, and with all due respect, worse than what's happened to you, and somehow it pushed them closer to God as opposed to further away from God. Like somehow people go through awful things that I can't even fathom, and yet they say, I have to lean on God. There's nothing else I can do. God is my rock. This is my foothold. I lean on God, because where else would I turn? And other people have that happen, and they say there is no God. They harden to God, and they blame God. And so even when there's this experience, it kind of shows, what are you made of? You lean on God, you turn to God, or you shake your fist at God, even when it's experienced. And you have to remember, in week 1, we talked about doubt masquerades as being more intellectual than it really is. Doubt usually comes from personal experiences. Something hurts you, something rocks you, and you say, man, it's causing me to doubt. It's causing my foot to be shaky on this foothold. You have personal experiences that cause you to doubt. So here's the 2 ways it can go. Suffering can kill you. It absolutely can kill you. It can destroy you, dehumanize you, make you bitter. It can make you a very bad person. But on the other hand, without any suffering, The truth is, you don't become deep. You don't become insightful. You don't become weighty. You don't become strong. And honestly, you can't become a good friend. Like, to have a friend who's never suffered, then you go through suffering and they're like, I just can't right now. They can't deal with that because they've never suffered. And so when you suffer, you have depth. The scriptures so many times correlate suffering to glory. Suffering and glory. So many passages in the New Testament. What's that about? Glory means weightiness. It means depth. It means weightiness. It means can't be blown away easily. And there's such a connotation between those two things. I recently read an essay called Theodicy by a late Lincoln Christian Seminary professor named S. Edward Tesh. And a theodicy, I just learned this word this year. It's an explanation or defense of why God would allow suffering. Why could he allow suffering and evil to continue in this world? Well, here's some ways and some reasons maybe why he would. And so that's what a theodicy is. And so years ago, Professor Tesh wrote this. He said, trials make possible the exercise, like think fitness, the exercise of faith, giving it a chance to grow. If one has never experienced the rigors involved in climbing a mountain, there's the Footholds image, he or she will never know the feeling of joy and of confidence that comes from reaching the top. A faith that is never tested may be genuine, but it can never equal the faith that has weathered the storms of life. What is that? It's weightiness. It's depth. It's the glory that will be revealed in us, Scripture says, even though we've suffered temporarily on earth. You know, when I was younger, as a friend, as a minister, as a husband, whatever it was, and still, it's not all gone today, but I used to think like when people suffered, struggled, they needed answers. And they do need some answers, that's for sure. I know there's times when I struggle, where I fall back on, but I know this is true, and I know this is true. So that is true, but more than anything, people, what they really want is someone to be with them, right? You know, like, what do you want when you suffer? Like, I want to know that I have friends. I want to know somebody's around me, someone cares. And every religion gives you answers about suffering. Do this, do this, do this. But Christianity, and only Christianity, says that God came here to be with us, that he showed up, that he was present, God with us. So Jesus came to experience poverty and loneliness and rejection and political injustice and torture. And at the end, remarkably, surprisingly, at the end of it all on the cross, he cries out, why? Why? God in the flesh does that. And that's the Christian teaching. That's the gospel. That's the good news of Jesus. That answers, they help some, but not all the way, not a lot sometimes. We need him in our suffering. And Christians, along with everyone else in the world, would admit, man, I don't know why God allows evil and suffering to continue. I can't fully answer that, give all the answers. I don't want to pretend I have all the answers to that. I just want to give you some clues to the mystery here. But whatever the reasons are, it can't be because God is indifferent. Whatever the reasons are, it can't be because he doesn't love us. Why would he let me to continue to suffer? It's not because he doesn't love you. Look at the cross. God shows up to be with us. And if there's anything we know in the clues of this mystery, man, that reveals so much that Jesus showed up to empathize and suffer with us and to also cry, why? Why? In that essay I mentioned, Theodicy, by Professor S. Edward Tesh, I'll close with this. He says, there is suffering in the world that is vicarious, meaning, something done or felt on behalf of another person. He says, that is, out of love and compassion, one may choose willingly to suffer for another, as a mother for a child, as a swimmer seeking to rescue a companion, as a firefighter who enters the building that's burning. The one may endure pain, even death, for the sake of the other, even if the other is a scoundrel or worse. Innocent suffering, he says, vicarious suffering. Thus it was with Jesus. He who was without sin bore the curse of sin for all who will come to God the Father through him. Not for his own sins, but for ours. He endured the cross, scorning its shame, in order that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Truly, by his wounds we are healed. Let's pray.